Hi, everyone. My name is Cindy. I'm a program officer at the Japan Foundation Toronto. Thank you for joining us this evening. Before we begin, just like to remind you that after the presentation, Dr. Basso will be conducting a Q&A. So please type in your questions into the chat box next to the live stream, and we will get to them as much as we can. As well, there is a link in the description of the video to a very short questionnaire. At the conclusion of this event, we would greatly appreciate it if you could fill out the questionnaire. It helps with our future programming, and your feedback is very important to us. I will be back later to conduct the Q&A. In the meantime, please welcome Executive Director Yuko Shimizu to introduce tonight's speaker.
Good evening and konbanwa minasama. I'm Yuko Shimizu, the Executive Director of the Japan Foundation Toronto. Welcome to another one of our online lecture series on Japan. Summertime has always been a good time for ghost stories. In the works of IZUMI Kyōka, one of Japan's most well-known authors, ghosts and monsters make frequent appearances. In today's talk, we will hear how these apparitions are portrayed in the renowned illustrator KOMURA Settai. In KOMURA Settai's illustrations, traditional Japanese spirits intersect with modern design sensibilities. We will learn the different ways he used space, optical illusions, perspective, and more to frame the mysterious and haunting figures of IZUMI Kyōka's imagination. If you like ghost stories or have an eye for masterful print media art, then you are in for a treat. We are joined today by Dr. Pedro Basso, Assistant Professor of Japanese Literature, Film, Visual Culture, and Popular Media at Purdue University. Dr. Basso received his PhD in Japanese from the University of California, Berkeley. His primary research focuses on Japanese visual culture and the relationship between text and image. Today's talk comes as a result of his research on IZUMI Kyōka, for which he is writing a manuscript entitled Enchanted Images, Illustration, Book Design, and Visuality in the Literature of IZUMI Kyōka. Thank you for lending us your time today, Dr. Basso. The screen is yours.
Hello, everyone. I would like to begin by thanking Japan Foundation Toronto for hosting this presentation kindly. And thank you also to Cindy Briffa-Chen, who has facilitated this presentation and has been my point person throughout this process of getting this presentation to everyone today. So today I'm going to be presenting on somebody who I believe is one of the most talented authors in Japanese literature, IZUMI Kyōka, along with one of the most innovative illustrators and graphic designers from modern Japan, KOMURA Settai. I'm going to be presenting what are the results of, for me, nearly 10 years of research. So I'm very excited to begin actually bringing this research to everyone who's watching here today. So I've attempted to give this talk to a combination of scholars, specialists, patrons of the Japan Foundation, and just general enthusiasts of art and literature of all backgrounds. So I'm hoping that there's going to be something of interest for everyone. So I'm going to go ahead then now and switch to my slideshow presentation and begin the talk. So we'll start here. And I'm assuming that everybody can see this. So my talk is then titled Whispering Spirits, Ghosts in the Literature of IZUMI Kyōka and Book Design of KOMURA Settai. And there are going to be a lot of images during this presentation. So hopefully you have access to your screen and you're able to follow along with this. It should be one of the more entertaining aspects of this particular presentation. So to begin, Japan occupies a unique position in the world of global art and entertainment today due to the ubiquity of its ghosts and monsters in cartoons, comic books, and video games consumed around the world. The history of Japan's fascination with monsters runs deep. From the very beginnings of Japanese prose fiction circa the late 9th century to a flourishing of compendiums of ghosts and monsters known as Youkai and sprawling series of illustrated fantasy epics in the 18th and 19th centuries. The chain between Japan's traditional monsters and the creatures of today's entertainment, however, was almost completely severed around the turn of the 20th century, a time when Japan plunged headfirst into a project of modernization following nearly 2 centuries of virtual isolation from the rest of the world. During this time, the rich tradition of Japanese ghost stories became something of an embarrassment for writers who sought to turn their literature toward real-world problems, or issues such as education, the family, and the life of the nation. As stories of the fantastic slowly gave way to realistic novels, one figure stood at the vanguard of the preservation of the Youkai tradition, IZUMI Kyōka, an author largely acknowledged as one of Japan's most important writers, and in my opinion, certainly the greatest writer of fantasy and horror stories during the period of his activity from 1892 to 1939. Today, I will show that Kyoka connected pre-modern and modern fantasy in more ways than one. In addition to carrying on traditions of writing about yokai, Kyoka created some of the most richly illustrated literature of any major Japanese writer of the modern canon. As I will demonstrate, the expression of Kyoka's monsters was not restricted to his words. They also found life in the art that accompanied his literature, especially in the book design of artist KOMURA Settai, a leading pioneer of the art of graphic design in modern Japan. In today's presentation, I will begin with a brief introduction to the world of yokai, followed by a discussion of Kyoka's role in both preserving and modifying this tradition. I will then describe his working relationship with Settai while highlighting some of Settai's most innovative book designs. I will then show how such designs reflect specific varieties of yokai from Kyoka's literature, while presenting details of one of Kyoka's eeriest short stories, Black Hair, or Kurokami, of 1918. Finally, I will show how both Settai and Kyoka used a combination of text and image to give new life to various monsters of the pre-modern period, such as the nopperabō, or faceless demon, and the tori akuma, or passing demon. So these are historical sources here from the mid-19th century, from the late 18th century, depicting traditional Japanese monsters before the modern era. So I'm not going to discuss these materials in too much detail, with the exception of the tori akuma, which I'll be discussing in more detail later. But these are the kinds of monsters that Kyoka is drawing into his world of modern fiction. So the nopperabō is a particularly popular Japanese monster, the faceless demon. I'll discuss the tori akuma more later, and then also other creatures like the taka-onna, or the giant woman, or tall woman, and the kera-kera-onna, or the laughing or cackling woman. The history of fantastic creatures in Japan goes back to the very roots of its literature, beginning with the earliest extant work of prose fiction from Japan, Tale of the Bamboo Cutter, Taketori Monogatari, which was likely recorded at some point between 871 and 909. Featuring a fairy princess from the moon as a protagonist, Tale of the Bamboo Cutter details a series of item quests that sound like something from out of a fantasy role-playing game, with characters who are sent to retrieve items such as the Buddha's stone begging bowl, a cloak made of fire rat fur, and a jewel obtained from a dragon's neck. Vengeful spirits and shape-shifting foxes are alluded to in one of the most important works of both Japanese and world literature, the Tale of Genji, Genji Monogatari, written by lady-in-waiting Murasaki Shikibu at the beginning of the 11th century, whose otherwise realistic portrayals of court intrigue and romance have led some scholars to proclaim it as one of the world's first novels. The number of unique ghosts and monsters would only multiply over the centuries that followed, until reaching a peak in the late 18th century in the work of scholar and artist Toriyama Sekien, who wrote and illustrated 4 volumes of encyclopedic bestiaries that collect information on hundreds of Japanese monsters. Toriyama's bestiaries include such bizarre creatures as the Wanyudo, a monk's head mounting onto a spinning wheel of fire, the Mikoshi, a towering demon who looks down on its victims with a long craning neck, the Akaname, a devious demon who licks grime off of old wooden bathtubs, and the Himamushi Nyudo, a slithering monk who licks candle wicks at night, leaving unsuspecting sleepers in total darkness. Monsters, ghosts, witches, and sorcerers multiplied throughout the pages of illustrated books known as kusazoshi in the early to mid-19th century, in series such as The Tale of Shiranui, which featured a spider magic-wielding princess as a protagonist, and The Tale of Brave Jiraiya, whose heroes summon giant frogs and slugs to aid them in their battles. With the opening of Japan to the wider world in the mid-19th century, however, such tales became passé, as writers endeavored to express the lives of modern people in psychologically realistic terms. One writer, IZUMI Kyōka, stood virtually alone in preserving and modernizing traditional tales of the fantastic, penning a vast body of literature that was inspired by the illustrated books and folk tales on which he was raised. Kyoka is unique among modern Japanese writers in that he was widely acknowledged as one of Japan's most important and talented authors by his peers, which included such towering figures of Japanese literature as Natsume Soseki, Akutagawa Ryunosuke, Kawabata Yasunari, and Tanizaki Junichiro, among many others. So probably some of these names, if you know Japanese literature at all, you might be familiar with some of them. So basically what I mean to say here is that a lot of the most well-known, famous, kind of critically acclaimed Japanese writers have gone on record saying that Izumi Kyōka is a genius, that he's a brilliant writer that everybody should read. I've also included here the names of a lot of women writers who are also inspired by Izumi Kyōka, which is a detail that's sometimes left out of kind of like the account of Izumi Kyōka fandom. So from Yoshia Nobuko on downward on that list are other people who have also expressed praise and admiration for Izumi Kyōka. But nevertheless, despite this rather impressive list of admirers, he remains by far a lesser known writer than some of these others, especially outside of Japan, due to a relative paucity of translations into foreign languages. The reasons for this are many, including foremost among them, the sheer difficulty of Kyoka's writing, whose impressionistic, surreal, and some have said avant-garde style of writing is oftentimes so tangled and obscure that it takes practice to understand even the most basic elements of his plots. So basically, translating Izumi Kyōka is incredibly difficult. Understanding him is very difficult. He's a much more difficult writer than somebody like Natsume Soseki or pretty much anybody else on this list. So I think that's a big reason why he's not more widely known or translated than he is. Another reason for Kyoka's lack of recognition could be attributed to poor timing. He wrote ghost stories at a time when critics had no interest in promoting such content, and thus ended up being ignored by the critical establishment for much of his career. Nevertheless, Kyoka remains a favorite writer among scholars, many of whom demonstrate a fanatic commitment to reviving and promoting his work, and his influence has been felt in various ways. The clearest connection between Kyoka and modern fantasy can be found in the work of Mizuki Shigeru, creator of the foundational monster manga and anime series, Gegege no Kitaro, who also adapted Kyoka's novels and biography to manga as one of the final projects of his life. Kyoka's name also lives on in the title of the most prestigious award for romantic and fantastic literature in Japan, the Izumi Kyōka Prize for Literature. Somewhat more tangential is Kyoka's revival as a character in Bungo Stray Dogs, a popular manga series written by Asagiri Kafka and illustrated by Harukawa Sango, in which Kyoka appears gender-switched as a young witch with the power to summon a snowy demon. These days, whenever I teach Kyoka in the classroom, I inevitably have a student who recognizes the author's name as a witch from a cartoon. To date, scholars have written some 100 books and over 1,000 articles on Izumi Kyōka in Japan, and yet much of this work remains largely unknown to anyone other than the most diehard specialists. This is due to the sheer volume of Kyoka's writing. During his lifetime, Kyoka wrote around 300 works of fiction, including novels, novellas, short stories, and plays, the shortest of which are only a few pages in length, and the longest of which reach into hundreds of pages, so like 400, 500, 600 pages. A handful of stories have received outsized attention, especially Kyoka's signature novella, The Holy Man of Mount Koya, along with a few others, such as A Day in Spring, A Song by Lantern Light, and A Quiet Obsession, all available in translation by the pioneering translator of Kyoka's work into English, Charles Shiro Inoue. My first encounter with Kyoka was via Inoue's translation of The Holy Man of Mount Koya, an experience that left such a profound impression upon me that 10 years later, I am still fascinated by an author whose work I have been obsessively dissecting as the core subject of my career. My obsession with Izumi Kyōka began with my first reading of The Holy Man of Mount Koya, a novella that completely changed my relationship to Japanese literature. As a fledgling student of Japanese fiction, I, like many of the students who I teach in the classroom today, could not help but feel a tinge of disappointment when I found that the series that had long drawn me to Japanese art and entertainment, from Sailor Moon to Final Fantasy to Dragon Ball Z, were nowhere reflected in Japanese literature prior to the contemporary media age, or so I thought anyway. Thus, when I stumbled upon The Holy Man of Mount Koya, I was struck by a feeling of awe. In it, I had finally found a historical writer who had created his own world of fantasy, a literary universe that featured a distinct cast of recurring character types, environments, monsters, and ghosts, all placed within a world of remarkable thematic and atmospheric consistency. The world that Kyoka created, long referred to by critics simply as Kyoka world or Kyoka no Settai, was moreover alluring, It is at turns ephemeral and sensual, dreamlike and nightmarish, tantalizing and complex. The Holy Man of Mount Koya, arguably is the centerpiece of this world, has often been referred to by critics as one of Kyoka's most flawless gems, an almost perfect fairy tale-like story of a monk who meets a seductive witch in the mountains who has the power to turn men into animals. Despite the high level of polish of this one work, however, it is far from Kyoka's only masterpiece. As Kyoka scholars almost inevitably find, the author's oeuvre is brimming with hidden gems, one of which I will introduce today, Black Hair, an obscure short story from 1918 that figures among Kyoka's most haunting tales. In my selection of this work, I am indebted to the scholarship of Tanaka Takako, who turned my attention to this story in her book on Kyoka and monsters titled Kyoka Tokai, or Kyoka and Horror Stories. In my own research, which I am currently working on converting into a book, I examined the illustration and graphic design of Kyoka's fiction, as well as the visual elements of his language. As I demonstrate, over a career that spanned nearly 50 years, Kyoka created one of the most extensively illustrated bodies of fiction of any Japanese writer of the modern canon, which features some of the most innovative book art to be found seriously from any time or place. During the early part of his career, Kyoka's stories were serialized on a daily basis in newspapers, where they featured massive black and white illustrations that cut across the pages of his text. So these are actual his stories as they appeared in newspapers early on in his career. And this is the kind of thing that I'm working on in my research for my book project, and that I just find fascinating and beautiful. In the middle part of his career, Kyoka's stories were collected in books whose boxes, covers, endpapers, and frontispieces were designed and illustrated by some of the leading Japanese artists of the era, including artists such as Kaburaki Kyokata, Hashiguchi Goyo, who's very widely known in the art world, and these are examples of some of his book designs for Kyoka here, Natori Shunsen, and the other subject of today's talk, Komura Settai. Toward the end of his career, Kyoka resumed serialization of his stories in newspapers, where they featured a combination of nostalgic and experimental artwork. Now, it must be noted that Kyoka was far from the only writer of the modern period to write illustrated fiction. Others, such as Soseki and Tanizaki, similarly wrote literature that was richly illustrated and designed at various points in their careers. However, Kyoka stands apart in terms of the sheer breadth, innovation, quantity, and unity of the design of his fiction. This is thanks in large part to his collaboration with the artist who defined the look of his books, Settai, whose career I will now introduce in brief. During his lifetime, Komura Settai was one of the most sought-after designers and illustrators in Japan. Born in 1887 in the city of Kawagoe in the prefecture of Saitama, just outside of Tokyo, Settai was trained in some of the most traditional of Japanese art forms during his youth, including the arts of calligraphy, shodo, and bird and flower painting, or kachoga. So this isn't actually his art. I don't think that we have his earliest work that he created during training, but this is just an example of the kind of traditional art that he was trained in. As a young adult, Settai enrolled in the Tokyo School of Fine Arts, the Tokyo Bijutsu Gakko, the premier institution for training young Japanese artists, where he majored in traditional Japanese painting, or Nihonga. So these are actually paintings by Settai. These are some of his more traditional paintings in the most traditional style that he created art in. But as you'll see, his art was really more of a hybrid of traditional styles and modern graphic design, which is, I think, what makes his art so interesting and kind of fresh and vibrant, this kind of meeting of different worlds of arts. So these are kind of a mixture of Nihonga with modern styles. Although Settai specialized in Nihonga, he also learned various techniques of modern art during his time at the school, such as shading, texturing, and realistic modeling of three-dimensional objects. Following graduation, Settai went on to work for the fine arts journal Koka, Flower of the Nation, from 1910 to 1912, during which time his duties consisted of carefully copying classical artworks, including Buddhist icons, illustrated picture scrolls, and ukiyo-e woodblock prints, which were reproduced in full color in the journal. Settai later moved into the vanguard of the modern art world when he was hired by the design department of the newly established Shiseido Cosmetics Company in 1918. And I think this is a particularly fascinating element of Settai's story. He was one of the founding members of Shiseido, which is, of course, still a major cosmetics company that probably many in the audience would be familiar with today. So these are actual items that he designed for Shiseido. So during his tenure at the cosmetics company, Settai established himself as a pioneer of the art of commercial and graphic design in Japan, designing a diverse catalog of consumer objects, including posters, advertisements, magazine covers, fans, kimono, sashes known as obi, makeup compacts, perfume bottles, and perfume packaging. So you can see some of the perfume bottles and makeup compacts that he designed, particularly here. Here you have an obi sash, including the box in which the sash would have been placed, the sash itself, a model wearing the sash. You can see the design and an example of another sash. Here a kimono designed by Settai, so you can see how broad his oeuvre was and the different things that he created during his life. And then these are magazine covers for various kinds of magazines, kind of general interest magazines, art magazines, etc. Later in life, Settai's portfolio would come to include the design of stage and film sets. So he also designed sets for movies, including movies in which Tanizaki was involved. So films that are a lot of this is no longer extant, unfortunately. Yeah, and he designed film sets and stage sets. Along with his work in commercial art, Settai was one of the most popular illustrators and designers of books of his era. Overall, Settai designed a total of some 300 books, while also contributing regularly to the illustration of popular novels in top-selling magazines and newspapers. And this is, I think, a lot of Settai's work is really impressive, but I'm most impressed particularly by his book designs. I've looked at a lot of book design from different time periods and different places, and I find Settai's book designs to be particularly innovative, to just be very bold, creative uses of the space of the book, the covers and everything, to create some truly cutting-edge designs. So these are just some examples. A lot of these books are by writers who are not particularly read anymore. So there hasn't been a lot of work done, particularly on the novels in which they appear or connecting the text to image. Although this work has appeared in catalogs quite frequently in recent years. So it's interesting to look at some of these images. And I think there's a whole project waiting here to kind of connect the images to the text and see how exactly Settai was illustrating these particular works. This is, I think, a particularly beautiful example of one of his book designs. And then he also did illustrations which are about as iconic and idiosyncratic as the book cover illustrations. So these are some of the stories that would have appeared in magazines and newspapers during his career. Following his passing in 1940, Settai's legacy was almost completely forgotten until a dramatic revival that has taken place over the past decade, which has seen a steady output of new catalogs of Settai's artwork on a near yearly basis. The revival has made possible Settai's resurrection from near total obscurity and much-deserved repositioning as a central figure in the history of Japanese illustration and graphic design. In the intervening years, however, a select group of people never forgot Settai's legacy, and that is fans and scholars of Kyoka's fiction, as well as bibliophiles and collectors of book art, who have regularly associated Settai's work in book design with Kyoka's literature. So for people who study Kyoka, basically every scholar of Kyoka knows who Settai is. Especially among scholars, Settai has often been treated not only as Kyoka's most important illustrator and book designer, but as a key contributor to the appearance and atmosphere of Kyoka's literary universe. So these are a couple of books that Settai designed for Kyoka. So closely is Settai's art related with Kyoka's literature that scholars have regularly likened their meeting to an event ordained by fate. Many have expressed the idea that Settai's art is not just an accoutrement of Kyoka's fiction, but rather the purest visual expression of its essence. For instance, writer Yanaga Toshiko claims that Settai's art, quote, captured the fundamental mystique of Kyoka's literature, whereas Tadaki Teiho, Kyoka's one-time student and later family friend, referred to Settai as Kyoka's truest pupil, albeit one who, quote, didn't write in prose, but rather used pictures to illustrate Kyoka's novels. I, for one, agree with the sentiment that Settai's artwork resonates with Kyoka's literature to a degree not often seen in similar collaborations. Furthermore, having spent years analyzing Settai's images, I cannot help but feel, like many others before me, that Settai's art somehow became fused with Kyoka's universe, as though his pictures were, in fact, the perfect visualization of his stories. This effect is achieved by a matching of literary and visual tropes, or an analogous production of formal structures and themes across both text and image. In terms of themes, Kyoka and Settai shared an abiding interest in the topics of ghosts, geisha, and the traditional space of the Japanese pleasure quarters, all of which had featured as core topics of the art and literature of the Edo period. As for formal resonance, both figures demonstrated a fascination with formal artistic structures, such as optical illusions, labyrinthine spaces, obfuscating architecture, and hidden corners of the urban environment. As I will show, Settai used his art to highlight the intersection of these themes and formal elements in Kyoka's literature, particularly in the illustration of figures who are at once both ghosts and geisha, and who wander through winding alleyways in dark urban environments. Settai's collaboration with Kyoka began with the creation of one of the most iconic covers in modern Japanese literature, that of Kyoka's 1914 novel Nihonbashi, which also happened to be Settai's inaugural work in book design. Named after the eponymous business district in central Tokyo, whose name literally means Bridge of Japan, the novel tells the story of a rivalry between geisha for the affection of a medical student, which ends in a grisly murder-suicide in the novel's climactic conclusion. Belying the turmoil of the narrative is Settai's serene depiction of the Nihonbashi district, which draws on a long history of depicting the same era in Edo period ukiyo-e. The mismatch in tone might be attributed to Settai's working conditions, for, according to the artist, Kyoka revealed nothing to him of the content of the book beyond its title. In response, Settai created a radically flattened and abstracted view of the Nihonbashi River and its riverbanks, which were once lined with white-walled warehouses. In ukiyo-e of the Edo period, Nihonbashi was regularly depicted in linear perspective by artists such as Hokusai and Eisen. So you can kind of compare here the linear perspective view with the one that Settai created. So these artists during the Edo period, Hokusai and Eisen, adopted the use of vanishing points from Italian art that arrived in Japan via the tiny Dutch concession of Dejima Island during the Edo period. Settai's decision to flatten the scene is ironic, for he would later make regular use of linear perspective in his work for Kyoka, including in the endpapers of the same book. The shift in perspective, however, makes for dramatic effect, for despite the serenity of the scene, the image pops out vividly from the surface of the cover by turning every aspect of an ordinary view of Nihonbashi into a discrete element of graphic design. One can pore over the image for hours, as I have done time and time again, and identify minuscule details that denote the obsessive care of the artist in creating a design that is both balanced and packed with lively variation. Throughout the image, tiny human silhouettes strike a variety of dynamic poses in alleyways and on boats, with poppy seed heads and straw-thin legs delineated with extraordinary precision. Care is taken even with the legs of docks lining the river and the steps of doorways to the warehouses, which alternate in number, pattern, and design. Overlaying the urban scene is a layer of red, yellow, blue, and white butterflies, which are, by reasoning of scale, so massive that they accentuate the nature of the image as one of pure surface or design. Missing from the image, however, as in Kyoka's eponymous novel, is the Nihonbashi bridge itself, which has been replaced only with the word Nihonbashi, the spine, written across the spine of the book. Thus, it is a word standing in for a picture, the spine of a book acting as a virtual replacement for a bridge. Opening the cover of Nihonbashi, from either front or back, one encounters Settai's endpaper illustrations, also created without input from the author, but somehow managing to capture the atmosphere of Kyoka's fiction to a degree unrivaled by any other illustrator. The images on the endpapers also establish the themes and spatial motifs that would come to define Kyoka and Settai's collaboration, such as claustrophobic city spaces, recessed alleyways, and faceless women hiding behind sliding paper doors, known as shoji. Each image portrays the neighborhoods of Nihonbashi during a different season, a fact that might not be immediately obvious to the viewer unfamiliar with the seasonal tropes of traditional Japanese poetry. Beginning with the first image on the right, following Japanese reading order, the willow tree is associated with spring, the moon with summer nights, and, more obviously, maple leaves with autumn and snow with winter. The four images all provide limited access to a hidden world, with perspectives that invite the viewer to gaze into the image, but therein only to encounter emptiness, jumbled architecture, and quiet scenes of women staring despondently at shadows or at the sky. Moreover, the one woman who does face the viewer resists their gaze with a visage that is completely blank, lacking eyes, a nose, or a mouth. Featureless faces would become a reoccurring trope in Settai's art for Kyoka, as the artist regularly hid tiny faceless women in the recesses of his endpaper illustrations for Kyoka's books. I argue that such images combine figures of the ghost and the geisha with yokai, such as the faceless nopperabō and the mystifying toriakuma. Turning now to Kyoka's short story Black Hair, I will explain how these yokai are reflected in Kyoka's fiction, along with Settai's book art. Black Hair describes the narrator's encounter with a series of ghostly women who wander the streets of Tokyo in the dead of night, announcing calamities that follow in their wake. Although Kyoka never uses the word toriakuma in this particular story, the appearance and behavior of these creatures is sufficient to make the connection clear. Moreover, as scholar Sudachi Sato has found, Kyoka refers directly to toriakuma by use of variant names such as tōrima, tōrimono, and magatoru nearly 60 times in his literature, thereby demonstrating his intimate familiarity with this traditional monster. Toriakuma literally means passing devil or demon passing by, and refers to a type of monster that appears in accounts from the mid-19th century. Toriakuma can be found in works such as 100 Stories of Worldly Affairs, Seiji Hyakudan of 1843 by Yamazaki Yoshinari, and a book of random recollections of the past and present, Kokonzōdan Omoide Soshi, written by Kurihara Tozuisha during the late Edo period. In such accounts, toriakuma are demons who appear suddenly in urban spaces and cause those who happen to stare at them too long to go mad and commit harm to both themselves and others. In order to avoid calamity or losing one's mind, the person who happens to see a toriakuma must shut their eyes and chant a Buddhist sutra, or otherwise steel their nerves with concentrated meditation until the demon passes them by. So that's what's occurring in this illustration from this work from 1843. You have a particularly brave samurai who resists the madness of the toriakuma because he's great at meditation. And in this story, the demon goes past his house and then causes his neighbor to go crazy. So that's what you see in that illustration there. Depending on the source, toriakuma are said to take on various forms, appearing as disheveled samurai or as old men. Kyoka, however, turns these same monsters of misfortune into beautiful women. According to Suda, over half of the toriakuma in Kyoka's literature appear as beautiful women. Moreover, while Kyoka's toriakuma cause disorientation and hallucinations in those who happen to catch sight of them, just like the traditional yokai, these are Kyoka's versions, Kyoka's toriakuma also announce impending large-scale disasters, such as fires and tsunamis, whose appearance they foretell in whispers. In Black Hair, Kyoka brings his female version of the toriakuma into the space of modern Tokyo. The story begins with a narrator lamenting his interminable insomnia. Although, as he writes, he does not suffer from insomnia 365 days a year, he spends close to every night awake until 2 or 3 in the morning, and sometimes is unable to fall asleep until after reading the morning newspaper. To a greater degree than in most of Kyoka's fiction, the narrator is clearly modeled on the author himself, as suggested by his place of residence in the quiet and hilly Bancho suburbs of Western Tokyo, where Kyoka lived for the last 29 years of his life, as well as his descriptions of insomnia, fondness of drinking with friends, and childlike reliance on his doting wife, all of which match autobiographical details of the author's life. The narrator's insomnia exposes him to a phenomenon that the sleeping residents of Bancho have likely never experienced, which is the nightly outburst of a woman's laughter, always around 2 or 3 in the morning. The regularity and liminal perceptibility of the laughter creates an atmosphere of eeriness. It happens every single night around the same hour, like clockwork, and yet it is difficult to tell where the laughter is coming from, or to ascertain its source. In fact, the narrator concedes that others might not even believe him, or might hold some reservations as to the reality of his account. Yet the narrator has no choice but to believe. He has heard the same laughter for the past 1.5 years at the same hour every single night. At first, the narrator remarks, he thought that the laughter might belong to a prostitute on her way back home from work, or otherwise to a madwoman wandering the city streets past midnight. But later he began to wonder if the laughter might not have some supernatural origin, as he associates the sound with shape-shifting foxes and tanuki, 2 of the most common varieties of yokai in Japanese lore, which are based on real animals. Frustrated by his inability to discover the source of the laughter, he remarks, concerned, I take a look outside my window, but there is nothing there, no shape, no form. Perhaps it was just a trick of my imagination. It becomes a habit, and I think that, in reality, I'm the only one who hears it, and I leave it at that. Black Hair shifts from an atmosphere of the uncanny to the downright fantastic as the narrator connects his account of nightly laughter to a story of repeated encounters with a ghostly woman on Tokyo city streets. On 3 separate occasions, the narrator runs into the same unnaturally tall woman with pale white skin and long black hair, whose face is hidden either by a downturned glance or a blinding light that obscures its details. On 2 occasions, the encounter is followed by a disembodied female voice announcing the outbreak of fire in Tokyo, while in a 3rd account delivered as hearsay, a separate character hears the ghostly voice announcing an impending tsunami. The passing voice announcing disaster clearly alludes to the figure of the Toriakuma, although other details suggest an amalgamation of various yokai. The creature's tremendous height recalls the Kerakera Onna, or cackling woman, a giant woman who appears suddenly in empty city streets to frighten the unsuspecting passerby with an outburst of laughter, or the Taka Onna, a jealous woman as tall as a 2-story building who appears from out of nowhere to frighten lovers caught in illicit trysts. In his first encounter with the ghost, the narrator runs into a woman who he surmises is on her way back from the public bath, and whose dress and posture are so casual that she appears to be standing in the hallway of her own home. Her figure is bathed in misty moonlight, while her height is so great that she cannot possibly be human. The narrator describes her in the following way. About how tall would I say she was? Looking around at the rooftops on either side of the street, the 2-story buildings, the signboards hanging from the eaves, the electric poles, I would say that her shoulders reached up to one and her chest to the other. I stared up in amazement as she looked down on me, the blackness of her hair, its brilliant luster spilling about her shoulders. It appeared as though she had loosened a knot of hair at the nape of her slender neck and let it cascade. Its shape so fluffy, it was like she was wearing a straw raincoat. Facing direct sunlight, her hair's jewel-like texture was gorgeous. Her skin was so white it was practically transparent, her eyebrows like distant mountain peaks floating in mist, distracted and thick. Her face was cast slightly downward, her nose high-bridged. As a sign of her disposition, her crimson lips were twisted to one side, her mouth hiding a faint smile. Those half-downcast eyes. Ah, if she were to open them fully, displaying her eyelashes, one would see pupils so black that the oceans and mountains would crumble and turn into poppy seeds. Staring at her figure, the narrator feels as though he has been bewitched or possessed by a fox. He is unable to look her full in the face as she passes him by, brushing by his sleeve. After 7 or 8 steps in the opposite direction, he finally gains the courage to look back, only to find that she has disappeared. He later sees her again from the open door of a train, through which her black hair flows into the train compartment, where it envelops and disorients him. He once again tries to look her straight in the face, but is blinded by a light of uncertain origin, perhaps emanating from her face itself, which is so bright as to obscure any of its features. Suggesting a direct connection to the Toriakuma, her appearance is accompanied by a fire that completely ravages Waseda, a district in west-central Tokyo. Despite the terrifying aspects of the woman's appearance, the composite figure of ghost, prostitute, demon, and otherworldly beauty described in black hair might be identified as Kyoka's ideal woman, a figure who appears over and over again as one of the central figures of his fiction. It is a figure who is given visual expression in Settai's illustrations, whose details parallel those of the ghostly woman in black hair. The most obvious difference is that Settai's women are of normal human heights and not towering giants as in the short story, and yet other details suggest a close parallel. Features shared by the women in Settai's illustrations and Kyoka's stories include pale white skin, lustrous black hair, slender bodies, and faces that are downcast or turned away from the viewer. Most distinctly, when such faces are turned toward the viewer, they are often completely blank, thereby recalling the faceless nopperabō, one of the most popular yokai in Japanese ghost stories, which makes multiple appearances in Kyoka's fiction. Another feature shared in common with black hair are the environments that the women inhabit, or urban settings consisting of deep alleyways, dense clusters of buildings, and vast city plazas, almost all eerily abandoned, thereby creating a dreamlike atmosphere of dissociation and haunting. The faceless women in Settai's illustrations are sometimes identifiable with specific characters in Kyoka's fiction, and other times not. What I wish to emphasize here, however, is that such women often combine elements of both ghosts and geisha. They are, like the woman in black hair, composite figures that are at once beautiful and terrifying, fleshly and ethereal, both women and ghostly apparitions of women. A specific example of the geisha as ghosts can be found in Settai's illustration for one of Kyoka's most famous horror stories, The Order Book, Chumoncho from 1901, included in the Died in Love collection, or Eisenshu of 1916, a volume collecting the order book in Nihonbashi. In the image, a thin, faceless woman stands on a snowy street rendered in linear perspective. Her environment can be recognized as an urban setting, but one that is defamiliarized due to the oddity of the architecture. To both sides of the ghostly figure stand box-like gray buildings, likely tea houses or geisha houses, judging by the setting of the narrative, as well as by characteristic fences known as kuro itabe, or black board fences, topped by guard spikes known as shinobi gaeshi, which might literally be translated as sneak thief deterrents. While such architectural features would be common enough in a traditional Japanese red light district, other elements of the image suggest a nightmare-like distortion of reality. For one, almost all of the buildings lack doors, whereas any visual apertures, such as the rows of boxes that apparently stand in for windows, are shut tight. When considered alongside the fences, guard spikes, and upright drawbridges, the image suggests an environment of exclusion or lack of access, in which the midnight wanderer is offered no sanctuary or repose. Even more uncanny is the woman who appears on the snowy sidewalk in the middle of the image. She is close enough to the foreground that her face should be visible, but it is perfectly blank, exactly like a nopperabō. Looking at her body, one is unable to find hands, whereas her willowy frame is so slight that she appears to be without bones. Rather than a person, she looks like a kimono hanging on a rack. The illustration is of the geisha turned ghost Onui, a character from the order book, who takes her own life after failing to murder her lover, and who exacts revenge as a ghost by possessing another geisha and forcing that geisha to slit her lover's throat before having her turn her straight razor upon herself. So these are details that, it's a lot of kind of like murder-suicides, and it's kind of grisly, but this is drawing squarely on the world of Edo period fiction. So this is the kind of thing that would have been like very common in the literature that Izumi Kyōka was raised on, which is the pre-modern, early modern Edo period Japanese literature. I could spend the next few hours examining scenes from other book designs by Settai, but as the time to wrap up approaches, I will content myself with very briefly describing a few more examples before returning to Black Hair to reconnect image back to text. In the front end papers of the selected works of Kyoka, Kyoka Senshu of 1915, in an illustration of Kyoka's novel Worship at Yushima, or Yushima Mode of 1899, a woman is depicted in black formal kimono descending a staircase from the Yushima Shrine in East Tokyo. The woman represents the protagonist's lover, a geisha who commits suicide after being secretly slipped an abortifacient by her madam, which causes her to lose her mind from grief. Although the figure in the image is absolutely tiny, it is nonetheless clear that she has no face. She is thus one more faceless geisha, or a woman without control of her life or hope for her future, at the same time that she is a living premonition of her own tragic death. The end papers for the Pleasure Quarter collection, Yurishu of 1915, depict women with their backs turned to the viewer. Their slumped over shoulders hint at an attitude of resignation or dejection, while the positioning of their faces, turned toward the recesses of the picture, suggest a permanent disconnection from the viewer. Look at the images as long as you like, and still you will never see their faces from the other side. More women without faces, or with faces cast askance, can be found on the covers and end papers of volumes such as the Karmic Library and the Book of Mandarin Ducks. Two of my personal favorites are the front and back end paper illustrations from the Love Grass collection, Aisoshu of 1918, which are among Settai's eeriest, most abstract, and boldest designs. On the front end papers, two court women from straight out of the world of Tale of Genji, whose historical illustrated editions featured characters of similar appearance, sit by a rectangular pool, while one holds a blue fan as the other combs her hair. Their environment is completely abstracted, a vast gray expanse covered in clouds of shimmering mica glitter, like the space of a dream. A similar image appears on the back end papers, but the figure is alone and of a later era. Reminiscent of a character from the world of Harunobu, one of the premier ukiyo-e artists of the mid-Edo period, she holds a traditional navy blue bullseye parasol, or konjanome, as she crosses a bridge over pale water from one empty gray block to another. Judging by her slumped over shoulders and near lack of motion, one figures that she has resigned herself to her fate, wandering perpetually through a dream world devoid of features. It is a world that one might liken to the afterlife, a place that brings to mind the shadowy hells of Sheol, Hades, or Yomi, the traditional underworld of Japanese mythology. As I draw toward a conclusion, I wish to return to the story Black Hair, which offers evidence of a close link between Kyoka's fiction and the illustration of his work, as the story itself dramatizes the magic of illustration via its words. In addition to disembodied voices and a giant female ghost, Black Hair relates two separate accounts of haunted print matter, or the haunting of paper and ink itself. In the first episode, the narrator stumbles upon a woodblock printed triptych by artist Utagawa Kuniyoshi at a secondhand shop. And this isn't actually the print referred to in the story, it appears to be a composite of various things, so I'm not sure that it's an actual print, but this is giving you an idea of the content of the print in the story. So the print of the story is titled Legends of Famous Women from Past and Present, and it depicts four of the protagonist's favorite heroines from some of his favorite works of illustrated Edo period fiction. So these include Takayasha Hime, a goblin queen who rides a giant toad and wields a polearm; Wakana Hime, a spider magic-wielding princess from the tale of Shiranui; Tsunade, a master of slug magic from the tale of brave Jiraiya; and Shiranui Hime, a famous warrior princess from Takizawa Bakin's strange tale of the crescent moon. The narrator attempts to purchase the print, but because it has been glued to the wall, the proprietress refuses to sell it, remarking that removal would damage the image. As the narrator desists from attempting to persuade the owner to sell the print, he witnesses Wakana Hime's snow white kimono emerge from the page with a rustle, while Takayasha Hime's toad appears to move of its own accord. Dejected, he apologizes to the ghostly figures in the print as he takes his leave. The second episode of A Haunted Page in Black Hair is among Kyoka's most bizarre and original descriptions of a ghost, and one that displays the full imaginative powers of an author whose ingenuity as a modern writer is often downplayed in favor of accounts of his traditionalism. In the second episode, the narrator witnesses a ghost not in a historical woodblock print, but in a freshly printed morning newspaper, which presents the report of a fire that the narrator witnessed following his third encounter with the giant woman. So this one is a little tricky. On the morning after the fire, which gutted the Kanda district in northeast Tokyo, the newspaper included a map of the fire-devastated area. The narrator claims to have nearly fainted when he saw the map, for he swears that he recognized the image of the ghost woman outlined by its contours. While at first glance, the graphic looked like nothing other than a map, upon closer inspection, he was able to identify the woman's body and clothing overlaid onto the image of Tokyo. As he puts it, the neighborhood of Hitotsubashi drew the hem of her kimono, outer jimbocho outlined the knot in her sash, and the open cuff of her sleeve pressed against her chest was represented by the train stop in inner jimbocho. So he's looking at this map, and apparently this is the actual map, is very likely the actual map that he was looking at, the author, when he came up with this idea that he saw this woman who's this demon who kind of presaged the fire in Tokyo. So you can imagine that he's looking at that and imagining that he sees a woman. So the narrator remarks, her black silhouette was slathered onto the page with ink, purple like blood wrung from the body of a spider, overflowing, thick, dripping, wet. The narrator checks other newspapers that reprinted the same map and finds that her image reappears in every one. The ingenuity and accompanying difficulty of Kyoka's description of the ghost is heightened as he further animates the scene. Looking closely at the page of the newspaper, the narrator remarks, the detailed place names and addresses inserted into the map must have been printed after sunrise. For while the surrounding text was thick, the place names were faded nearly to white, like mist or haze, appearing like a phantom seen through the single layer of a sliding paper door. Lest his story be doubted, the narrator urges the reader to dig up a copy of that day's newspaper to confirm his tale. Having delivered a story chock full of traditional yokai, Kyoka ends by inventing a new ghost, one that could only exist in the modern age of typeset print. It is a ghost that sits comfortably within the illustrated world of his fiction, whose pages, covers, and endpapers were similarly adorned by ghostly women haunting the streets of Tokyo with their vague and ephemeral figures. And that's my presentation. This is just a quick bibliography of where I got most of the images relating to Settai's art from, and I referenced a number of other things in this paper. But yeah, there are a lot of catalogs of Settai's art coming out every year recently in Japan, so there's kind of a major reevaluation of his work, and I think it's quite beautiful, so if you would like to look into it further, please go ahead. And that's it for my presentation, so I think I can come back here. Yeah, okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation, Dr. Basso.
Mhm.
And just a reminder to our audience, we will start the Q&A portion of our talk directly, so please ask your questions in the chat. We will bring them up on screen for Dr. Basso to answer. And while we are waiting for questions to come in, I had a couple of my own as I was listening into this fascinating conversation. One thing that struck me was when you were mentioning the book design Settai did for Nihonbashi, that he wasn't told the content of the book itself. He sort of just went on the title alone. Was that ever corrected when they collaborated further? Was he able to know the content of the books he was designing?
Yes, yeah. So Kyoka and Settai did end up developing like a more close working relationship. So that was pretty much like a trial. He might not have, so Settai was really like a young up and coming artist. He hadn't really been tested in that particular field. So, it's possible that Kyoka just didn't trust him that much, didn't want to reveal the particular content. But afterwards, they worked together much more closely. A lot of the works that Settai illustrated were either stories that had been published earlier, so like a decade or 2 decades earlier, in a lot of cases, in other cases not. There was a later work that they worked on together, Sankai Hyobanki, which is one of Kyoka's longest novels, and it's kind of fascinating, kind of a mess. It's really difficult work. But that's one in which the Settai and Kyoka actually toured around Tokyo and also the Noto Peninsula, which is in Ishikawa Prefecture. Actually, I don't remember if they went together. I think Kyoka went there and sent Settai postcards so that he could get an idea of what the location looked like, so that he could create settings based on what he saw in those postcards. So yeah, they did actually work together in designing illustrations later. So they kind of began with him knowing nothing. And then after Settai realized okay, I want to work with this person, then they started working more closely and actually touring the sites that they wanted to illustrate together later on. Yeah, thank you. It's a great question.
And I'm wondering, was there ever sort of a reciprocal relationship as Settai developed more of his artistic style? Did his art have any influence on Kyoka?
That's a good question. I would guess no, not so much. Just kind of based on a hunch, just because Kyoka just tended to go in his own direction and just really do whatever he wanted to do, whatever he was, his style is just so different from everyone else. And I don't think you really see enough of a change in his work that you could pinpoint this is Settai's influence. I mean, I think one thing that's fascinating is that a lot of Settai's most beautiful designs are the ones that he designed working with these various other writers. So I think maybe, it's difficult to say is it because he first worked with Kyoka that he developed that style that he then brought to other people? So I think that would kind of require another project that has not been undertaken as of yet, in which somebody looked at how did he work with other writers? And I think the biggest reason that hasn't happened is because almost without exceptions, the other writers that he worked with, they were popular writers, and some of their works survives maybe in popular memory, but they're by no means writers like Kyoka or Soseki, who are remembered in that same way today. So that would be really interesting to see, to trace that. But yeah, my guess is that Kyoka just continued to do his own thing, no matter who he worked with.
I do want to mention for our audience who might be in Toronto that our library does have a few of Izumi Kyōka's novels that are translated into English if you want to borrow them. And if you are in Canada or the United States and you happen to read Japanese, our Overdrive library does have, I think one of the complete collections of Izumi Kyōka's stories in Japanese that's available. For details, please check out our website at jftor.org. And now let's turn to some of our audience questions. Okay, from Monica, thank you for a great presentation. The ghost in the map, can we as readers see it too in the illustration of the map, or if it's only delusion of the narrator? I was trying to see it too, and I was like,
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it's just Kyoka's fancy, right? It's just his imagination. I think he just thought oh, this would be a great story of this ghost emerged from the map. So normally you wouldn't have access to that map, right? Like you would just read the story. And I actually just found that image today. I mean, like I had, as I was looking through my materials, I was like, oh wait, this is actually the map that he's referring to. So Sudachi Sato actually, like, Kyoka kind of makes this dare. He's like, oh, reader, go find the newspaper from such and such a day and confirm my story, which is, like, of course, impossible to do. But Sudachi Sato, who's a scholar, researcher in Japan, is like, okay, I'm going to go find that newspaper. And he did, and he brought up that image, and then it's reproduced in Tanaka Takako's book. So that gives you the opportunity to actually observe it, and maybe that kind of like dispels some of the magic of what it is that the narrator is claiming to see. But I just wanted to present it here to kind of make it clear, like, this is what this passage is referring to, because I had to read it, like, and this often happens with Kyoka, like I had to read it like 4 or 5 times just to figure out, like, what is he talking about? Because it's just so bizarre that he's like looking at this map and it's ghosts.
He clearly sees the world in his mind as he's writing, because his descriptions are so vivid.
Exactly. Yeah. So he's kind of animating the world, I think, in ways that maybe we don't see it, but he's animating it in that particular way.
Okay, let's go to our next question from S. Joy. Which of Settai's illustrations for Kyoka's work is your favorite, and why?
I think it's those ones that I showed of, like, the women kind of crossing over those large empty plazas. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's such a kind of bold use of empty space, of gray, of kind of washed out color. It's just like very much modern art. So there's something classical about it. I think it's cool that he brings in motifs from like older Japanese art. So he's got like the Tale of Genji characters, which is cool. Because the art from the Tale of Genji, the earliest extant version of the Tale of Genji, the Tale of Genji Emaki, or picture scroll, let me rephrase that. So the earliest extant copy that we have of anything of the Tale of Genji is an illustrated version that has characters that look like that. So I think it's really cool that he draws on the history of Japanese art, but then he places it in this defamiliarized context. I also just find those images to be very dreamlike. It just kind of reminds me of a dream in which space doesn't really make sense, and like, the relationship of people to their environment doesn't make sense. It's all kind of mixed up and jumbled up.
It's oddly serene when you look at them.
Yeah, and I can't, it's like I'm describing them in a way that it sounds kind of depressing, but it's also kind of beautiful at the same time. Like, it's serene. So I think that's kind of an amazing balance that he's struck between like calm and beauty and serenity, and then also something kind of haunting. So I think those might be my favorite.
Next question's from John. John asked, thank you for such a great talk. Do you know if any of the films KOMURA Settai worked on still survive?
I would have to double check that. I want to guess that no. Yeah. So there's a lot of there was a lot of film based on Izumi Kyoka's work that did not survive. So I want to get these details correct. So, like, for example, Mizoguchi created a film based off of Nihonbashi that does not survive, which is really sad to me, because I think that would be fascinating to be able to like do a comparison of the film and the book, and also like Tanizaki worked on a film that was an adaptation of another story, Katsushika Sunago, which also doesn't survive. So that's, like, I think particularly tragic, and that's just kind of like the history of Japanese film, is that, like, most so much of like pre-1940s film, due to the volatile nature of film, does not survive. So I would guess no, but so much of his stage design does survive. And then a lot of that stage design was for like major plays. So like for the one that I showed in this particular presentation, I think was for a major production. So he was like a big name player in like stage and film set design.
It's interesting we keep going back to Nihonbashi, because when I was looking up KOMURA Settai, apparently Japan's going through a Settai revival, and last year at the the Mitsui Memorial Museum, which is located in Nihonbashi, they had a Settai exhibition in the spring, just last year.
I did not know that. I need to note of that. Mitsui. Okay, I'm going to take note of this. Actually, here, I have a pen right here. Let me write that down. Okay. Where did you say it was? The Mitsui
The
what?
Mitsui Memorial Museum.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Thank you.
So it's last spring 2021.
Awesome.
This is not so much a question, but a comment from Patricia, who said, as an artist living near Nihonbashi, this was an inspiring presentation. And just following up on that, we've seen how unique Settai's illustrations are. What are some of the takeaways modern artists can draw from his work, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I have a few catalogs that are kind of like looking at Settai's influence on later artists. So I haven't really perused those in depth yet. So I would have to look at them more closely. I mean, I guess one thing that I would say is that one thing that really draws me to Settai, and one reason that I'm so fascinated by him is that I find his style to be so idiosyncratic. So that's not to say that there are others who don't have like some element of his art, but it's like just immediately recognizable. Even like a very simple face that's drawn with like just an economy of line, and there's almost nothing there, but somehow it looks like him. So I'm like I work on literature by training, so it's a little bit difficult for me to trace speak to some of the technical aspects of art. Although I'm always interested in learning more about that and speaking more concisely about that kind of thing. But it is a good question. So there are some catalogs recently that like look at later artists who are in some ways inspired by Settai, but still like their work doesn't particularly strike me as being that similar. And IZUMI Kyōka is kind of a similar figure in that there's really nobody who writes anything like Kyoka in Japanese. At all, like not even close. So like, people will say that like Tanizaki, Kawabata, who are big fans of Kyoka, maybe kind of carry on his spirit and their kind of work in the way that they kind of work in the style of like aestheticism or romanticism or that kind of thing. But there's really no comparison. Like I know sometimes people like to avoid saying that things are unique or that there's nothing else like them, but I think like there's really nothing else like Kyoka at all. It's like he just invented his own language.
That actually goes into our next question. Other than Bungo Stray Dogs, have you found any other current Japanese writing that is inspired by either Kyoka or Settai? And I would like to expand that question to include anything in popular culture, whether it's horror films or manga or TV.
Yeah.
Is there anything that's like, or is he just so unique that there's no imitation?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and that's like a big question that I'm looking at in my book is like, what is the influence of Kyoka? Like, why does he matter, or does he matter beyond just his work? So in terms of film, there are a lot of directors who have adapted Kyoka's works to film. So like Suzuki Seijun, like major directors. Mizoguchi has 2 extant films that are based off of Kyoka's work. Terayama Shuji. So some really important big name directors, but that's mostly older stuff. So it's not like current manga anime. If anybody has an answer to this or has any inklings, I would love to know. I think the biggest name, Mizuki Shigeru is the most obvious one because his work is like, he's practically a scholar of Kyoka and his adaptations of Kyoka. So that's kind of like the biggest link that I've been able to find so far, because Mizuki Shigeru is so influential in bringing yokai back, right, to modern Japanese art and entertainment. I think that's a very solid connection there because it's kind of like he liked Kyoka liked yokai, and he draws those yokai into the present world. There are things that I have like suspicions or an inkling, or maybe just a feeling like this feels kind of like Kyoka's world. So like Inuyasha by Takahashi Umiko, that feels very much, there's like the monsters, there's the historical settings, and then also Demon Slayer reminds me in some ways it's completely different, right? Because Kyoka's literature is not about like fighting a series of monsters and killing a series of monsters, right? Like anime is. But the world just feels very familiar. That kind of Taisho era mixture of like classical Japanese monsters and modernization. So I'm not saying that any of these people were actually inspired by Kyoka, that they read Kyoka or anything like that. So I would have to kind of come up with stronger ties. But I feel like there's a resonance there, that there's kind of, even if it's not direct, that there's kind of this revival of a world of traditional Japanese monsters that was kind of kept alive for a period in which nobody was giving any value to that kind of thing by Kyoka. So that's kind of the best answer that I have for that at the moment.
Our audience, Monica, suggests Natsume's Book of Friends. Have you heard of that anime before?
Natsume's Book of Friends. Okay.
It's a very quaint story about yokais.
I want to say that I've seen like an anime adaptation of the Castle Tower, Tenshu Monogatari, on YouTube at some point. I would have to look it up again. And there's something called Temari Uta, which are like handball songs, that I also found some kind of anime adaptation on YouTube at some point. This is like just very vague information. It's not very scholarly. But I have seen, like, I'm pretty sure I've seen these things. So I have to go back in and look and see if I can find them. But yeah, thank you for that.
There's definitely a wave of, I think, yokai and Japanese monster influence in popular culture that's bleeding internationally. Just judging by our audience reactions, like the amount of names they can come up with is, I think, would have been surprising 20 years ago when Inuyasha came out. And as an aside, if you're interested in Japanese yokais and Japanese horror stories, our colleagues at Japan Foundation New York is actually having a talk, an online talk about Japanese yokai influences on modern Japanese horror movies. So if you're interested, you can check out their website.
No kidding. Who's the colleague?
Just the Japan Foundation New York office.
Okay, cool. Okay. Cool, thank you.
So as we're wrapping up our talk, as it is getting pretty late, I just had a last question, and I'm a little bit weary of getting into it because it might be a deep question. But in terms of the faceless women and the particular one you mentioned where it looked like the woman was lacking bones and was just this kimono, have there been a lot of feminist readings into Izumi Kyōka and particularly the Settai's illustrations of his stories in the way that geisha and monster women are portrayed?
Yeah, no, I mean that's great. It's a huge question, so there's kind of been that is a really complicated question. So there have been feminist readings of Kyoka. There have been some who try to like read his work in like explicitly feminist ways, in which scholars will see Kyoka as kind of a feminist or a proto-feminist. There's also been scholarship that pushes back against that. This is like, no way, this is a guy who's like obsessed with geisha and the pleasure quarters and like this is kind of objectifying women and that kind of thing. So it is a really complicated question. I think one of the best books on that is there's a book by Nina Kornietz. So it's not specifically on Kyoka. It's called Dangerous Women, Deadly Words, in which Professor Kornietz draws on Lacan. It's super difficult, but I think kind of fascinating. So she draws on kind of like Lacanian psychology, and she reads, I think Kyoka in this really sophisticated way that's kind of critical, but also appreciative. I think in a way that's really balanced and fair. I think one thing that I would say, and this is something that I'm trying to point out in my work, is that Kyoka has fascinating female characters, whether they're good or bad or whatever. There's a range of female characters. So they're not all geisha, they're not all prostitutes, which it seems like, right? Looking at this, and part of that is due to kind of like a legacy, right, of Edo period literature, in which that's what so many of the characters in Edo period literature were. But he has other characters, and I don't think I've seen anybody write about this before. I haven't read everything on Kyoka, but he has characters who are like nurses, who female characters, right, who own stores, who are scholars, and that one is like, I mean, it sounds ridiculous today, but like, in the early 20th century, kind of writing these characters who are like proficient in like Russian literature or Chinese classics or that kind of thing. So he has those characters like that, and they tend to be outcasts, and they, have unfortunate fates, and they end up dying and that kind of thing. But that's also true of like most of his characters. So I think if anything, if you compare his writing to like writing by other male writers of the time, he has way more female characters that are at the very least interesting. So, you know, he has a lot of oversights. There's a lot that that can be kind of myopic in his vision, but his female characters are fun, and and he also kind of points back to like these characters from an earlier time period, like these hime-sama, these princess characters that I was talking about, who like so in the Edo period there actually were female characters who like had magic powers and used swords and spears and that kind of thing. So I haven't seen like almost any scholarship on that. So it's another thing that I'm kind of interested in developing at some point if I can.
Well, I'm sorry for ending this on such a complicated question. I trying to think of a lighter question to end this talk on, and I'm drawing a blank. So, well, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for everyone who tuned in. Again, please check out the questionnaire link in the description of the video. Your feedback is very much appreciated. Oh, and Dr. Basso, would it be okay for our audience to reach out to you if you have questions? That would be great.
Yeah, please do. No problem. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. But yes, please do reach out to me, and I'll try to come up with answers.
And that is the end of our presentation today. Thank you so much for your questions and your kind comments. Please check out our website or sign up for our newsletter for future JFT events. And have a good rest of the night.
Yeah, thank you so much. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you for attending.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.